Today, we're ranking every major submachine guns of World War II, from the jam-prone death traps that killed its own soldiers to the legendary weapons that changed urban warfare forever.
11. Type 100, Japan. Japan entered World War II with a military philosophy rooted in the Meiji era: precision, discipline, the bolt-action rifle as the backbone of the infantry. Submachine guns, in the Imperial Japanese Army's view, were somewhat beneath them, an inelegant solution for an army that prided itself on marksmanship. That attitude shows in the Type 100. Introduced in 1942, the Type 100 was chambered for the 8mm Nambu cartridge, a round that, even by the standards of the day, was considered underwhelming. Not particularly fast, not particularly hard-hitting. It was fine for a pistol. For a submachine gun expected to dominate a jungle firefight, it left a lot to be desired. But the round wasn't even the main problem. The main problem was production. Early models were manufactured with a level of craftsmanship that would have been admirable on a hunting rifle: carefully machined components, polished metal, detailed finishing work. That sounds good until you realize that while Japan was lavishing attention on individual Type 100s, the Soviets were stamping out PPSH-41s by the hundreds of thousands. Japan produced roughly 10,000 Type 100s by 1944. Then the situation became desperate, and a simplified version arrived: rougher, cruder, a mass production attempt that came far too late to matter. The paratrooper variant had a folding stock that was genuinely clever, but cleverness on a drawing board doesn't win battles. Soldiers who used it reported a weapon that worked. It fired, it cycled, it didn't regularly jam, but that offered nothing exceptional. In a theater where American Marines were closing in with Thompsons and grease guns, the Type 100 was Japan's acknowledgement that they'd come late to a conversation that everyone else had been having for 20 years.
10. United Defense M42, USA. If you've never heard of the United Defense M42, you're not alone. It's the ghost of American submachine gun history, present, technically competent, and almost entirely overlooked. Designed by Carl Swebulus, the M42 was chambered in 9mm parabellum rather than the .45 ACP that Americans were more familiar with. The idea was that a 9mm weapon would be easier to supply in European theaters, where German and Allied ammunition was everywhere. Sensible logic. The execution was decent. It was reliable, reasonably accurate, and had a twin magazine feed system that was genuinely innovative. You'd load two magazines side by side, and when one ran dry, you simply slid the other into position. Fast reloads in theory. In practice, the M42 got a quiet thumbs down from the US military, who were already committed to the Thompson and later the M3. It wasn't rejected because it was terrible, it was rejected because it wasn't meaningfully better than what already existed, and the logistics of introducing another weapon, another manual, another set of spare parts into an already complex supply chain simply wasn't worth it. The OSS, America's Wartime Intelligence and Special Operations Agency, procured a number of them for clandestine operations, primarily because the 9mm round was easier to hide in occupied Europe. So the M42 found its niche in the shadows, used by agents and resistance fighters who needed something that wouldn't immediately announce American. It's a weapon that did its job quietly and was quietly forgotten. There's almost something poetic about that for a weapon that spent its life in the OSS, but competent and forgettable still lands it at number 10.
9. Erma EMP, Germany. To understand the Erma EMP, you need to understand that Germany was actually ahead of almost everyone in submachine gun development. The MP-18, designed by Hugo Schmeisser in the closing months of World War I, had already demonstrated that a compact automatic weapon could be devastatingly effective in trench warfare. Germany came into the 1930s with more institutional knowledge about SMGs than virtually any other nation. The EMP, Erma Machine and Pistol, was the product of that lineage. Designed in the early 1930s, it was a professional, well-built weapon. Chambered in 9mm parabellum, it had a wooden stock that gave it rifle-like handling, a solid feel in the hands, and it worked reliably in reasonable conditions. The problem is the phrase, reasonable conditions. And when North African sand got into those tight tolerances, or when Russian mud found its way into those precision-fitted parts, the EMP had a habit of making its operators very unhappy at the worst possible moments. It also came with a side-feeding magazine design that, while functional, made certain shooting positions awkward. And by 1940, Germany already had something better waiting in the wings. The EMP served adequately in the early war, particularly in Spain during the Civil War, where it gained some combat experience. But it was a weapon whose era passed quickly, replaced by a design that understood the brutal realities of modern industrial warfare in a way the EMP simply did not.
8. M1928A1, Thompson, USA. Now we're into complicated territory, because the Thompson is famous. It is perhaps the most culturally iconic submachine gun ever made, associated with Chicago gangsters, Irish rebels, Humphrey Bogart films, and the American GI fighting his way through Europe. There's a reason it has that reputation. At its best, the Thompson was a formidable weapon. The 1928A1 was heavy, brutally, punishingly heavy. A loaded Thompson with a drum magazine weighed over 10 kilograms. For comparison, a fully loaded M1 Garand, a rifle, weighed around 4.5. Carrying a Thompson through the jungles of Guadalcanal or up the mountains of Italy was a test of physical endurance as much as combat readiness. Then there was the drum magazine. The 50-round drum was so loud when it rattled that soldiers on night operations were known to remove them and switch to the quieter 20-round box magazine. A magazine that compromises your tactical silence is a significant design failure. It fired the .45 ACP round, which was powerful and effective at close range, but lost velocity quickly, limiting its useful engagement distance compared to 9mm chambered competitors. The Thompson was later simplified into the M1 and M1A1 variants, which addressed many of these issues. Those were genuinely better weapons. The soldiers who carried it often loved it for its stopping power. The logisticians who had to supply it were less enthusiastic.
7. Austin, Australia. Australia in 1942 faced a genuine crisis. Japanese forces were advancing through the Pacific. The fall of Singapore had been catastrophic. Supply lines from Britain were stretched to breaking point. Australia needed to arm its soldiers, and it needed to do so largely on its own. The solution was to look at what the British were already making, the Sten, and the Germans were already making, the MP40, and build something in between. The result was the Austin. And the result was mixed. The Austin took the MP40's folding metal stock and telescoping recoil mechanism, combined it with the Sten's receiver and trigger group, and added Australian manufacturing. The folding stock was a genuine improvement over the Sten's fixed wire stock. It made the weapon more compact, more useful in tight spaces like the jungle terrain Australian soldiers were increasingly fighting in. The problem was complexity. The MP40's internals, while excellent in a German factory with German engineering tolerances, were harder to reproduce with the tooling available in wartime Australia. The Austin ended up costing significantly more to produce than the Sten, and its reliability, while acceptable, wasn't dramatically better. Australian soldiers, bluntly, didn't love it. The Owen gun was being developed at almost exactly the same time, and when that weapon entered service, the comparison was unflattering to the Austin. The Owen was simpler, tougher, and better in the mud. The Austin wasn't a bad weapon. In a world without the Owen gun, it might have been remembered more kindly. But history judges weapons against their contemporaries, and its contemporary was, as we'll discuss later, one of the best submachine guns of the entire war.
6. Sten MK2, United Kingdom. The Sten is one of the most remarkable weapons in military history, not because it was the best, but because of what it represents. By 1940, Britain had its back against the wall. Dunkirk had cost the army enormous quantities of equipment. The threat of German invasion was real. Churchill's government needed infantry weapons, and it needed them by the hundreds of thousands immediately, without straining a manufacturing base that was already building Spitfires and Hurricanes. The Sten MK2 was the answer, a weapon so simple it could be manufactured by small workshops with basic equipment. The entire receiver was essentially a steel tube. The barrel could be removed and replaced in seconds. The horizontal side-feeding magazine was a direct copy of the German MP28, which meant captured German ammunition could be used in a pinch. Estimated cost, around 10 shillings per unit, around $2 in American money of the time. It was ugly. Soldiers called it the plumber's nightmare and the stench gun. The magazine feed was notorious for causing jams if the weapon was held by the magazine housing, which was the natural thing to do and which every soldier instinctively tried. The safety mechanism was rudimentary, and there were documented cases of the weapon firing when dropped. And yet, the Sten became one of the defining weapons of the resistance movements across occupied Europe. It could be disassembled into parts small enough to hide in a coat. It could be manufactured in a basement workshop and smuggled through checkpoints. It put automatic firepower in the hands of ordinary people fighting for their lives against occupation. That earns it genuine respect, even at number 6.
5. M3A1 Grease Gun, USA.
If the Thompson was the movie star of American small arms, glamorous, heavy, beloved, the M3 was the workman who actually got things done. America, by 1942, had recognized that the Thompson was too expensive and too complex for mass production. The solution was a design study with a ruthless brief: make something that fires 45 ACP reliably, costs as little as possible to produce, and can be manufactured using stamped sheet metal rather than machined components. The result was the M3. Its nickname, the grease gun, came from its visual resemblance to the automotive tool, and it wasn't meant as a compliment. But that slow rate of fire turned out to be a genuine advantage. It was controllable.
Single shots were achievable with trigger discipline, ammunition was conserved, and in close-quarters fighting, room clearing, vehicle combat, the cramped interiors of armored personnel carriers, manageable accuracy mattered far more than cyclic rate. The M3A1, introduced in 1944, simplified the design even further by removing the manual cocking handle and allowing the operator to cock the weapon by inserting a finger directly into a recess in the bolt. Fewer parts, easier to manufacture, easier to maintain in the field. Armored crews loved it. Tankers who needed something compact and reliable when they had to exit a burning vehicle found the M3A1 ideal. It wasn't a weapon that anyone wrote poetry about. It was a weapon that worked, that you could fix with minimal tools, and that kept working when you got it wet, dirty, or knocked around inside a Sherman tank. By the war's end, over 600,000 had been produced. It served in American military inventories for decades after. That kind of longevity doesn't come from looking pretty.
4. Beretta Model 1938, Italy. Italy's military performance in World War II is a subject that history has, frankly, been somewhat unfair to, and the same unfairness has extended to Italian weapons. The Beretta Model 1938 is consistently under-discussed in English-language histories of the war, and that's a genuine oversight, because this weapon was, by almost every technical measure, exceptional. Designed by Tullio Madangoni, the Model 1938 was built to a standard that would have been considered luxury engineering by the Army's frantically stamping out mass-produced weapons elsewhere. It had twin triggers, a semi-automatic trigger and a fully automatic trigger, giving the shooter immediate, intuitive choice of fire mode without any selector switch. This sounds like a small thing. In a firefight, it wasn't. The 9mm parabellum round as chambered in the Model 1938 was loaded to higher pressure than the standard German specification, giving Italian-manufactured ammunition slightly better performance from this weapon. The bolt was machined from solid steel, the wooden stock was furniture grade, the barrel had a compensator to genuinely reduced muzzle rise. The downside was the same as many quality items. It was expensive and slow to produce. As the war turned against the Axis, Italian manufacturing capacity struggled to maintain production numbers. The Model 1938A and subsequent variants introduced simplifications, but even simplified, the Beretta remained more labor-intensive than British or American alternatives. For a soldier lucky enough to carry one, it was a genuine pleasure, smooth, accurate, well-balanced, and reliable. Italy may have had a complicated war, but the Beretta Model 1938 was a weapon that any army in the world should have been proud to field.
3. MP40, Germany. The MP40 is probably the most visually recognizable submachine gun in history. If you've watched any film set in World War II, you've seen it. The folding metal stock, the distinctive pistol grip, the forward-angled magazine. It became the cinematic shorthand for German soldier in the same way the Thompson became shorthand for American GI. Unlike some weapons that gain reputation beyond their actual performance, the MP40 genuinely deserved its status. Designed by Heinrich Vollmer and manufactured by Erma, correcting from the EMP's shortcomings notably. The MP40 was a weapon built around stamped and pressed components rather than machined parts. This was revolutionary thinking for Germany in 1940. The Wehrmacht understood that the coming war would be fought on an industrial scale, and weapons that required skilled machinists to produce would become bottlenecks at the worst possible moments. The result was a weapon that balanced quality and producibility in a way few designs achieved. The folding stock made it compact enough for paratroopers, vehicle crews, and NCOs who needed to move through tight spaces. The 9mm parabellum round was effective and widely available. The rate of fire, around 500 rounds per minute, was controllable. German soldiers on the Eastern Front, fighting in temperatures that froze lubricant solid, found the MP40 more dependable than almost anything else they carried. Its one notable weakness was the single-stack 32-round magazine, which some soldiers found insufficient for sustained automatic fire. A twin magazine adapter was developed, but it added weight and complexity. The PPSH-41 71-round drum magazine would have seemed like science fiction to an MP40 user. But for a weapon that had to be produced by the hundreds of thousands, fielded in every climate from Norwegian fjords to Libyan deserts, and maintained by men who weren't gunsmiths, the MP40 was a near-perfect solution to an almost impossibly difficult engineering problem.
2. PPSH-41, USSR. If you want to understand why the Soviet Union won the Eastern Front, a significant part of the answer is a weapon designed by Georgy Spagin in 1941 and put into production so rapidly that it seems almost impossible. Spagin delivered something extraordinary. The PPSH-41 was designed from the start to be manufactured using basic industrial equipment, the kind found in a tractor factory or an automotive plant, which was relevant because Soviet tractor and automotive factories were converted to produce it. The receiver was made from stamped sheet metal, the wooden stock was simple, the total number of parts was minimal. Production figures are almost incomprehensible. Approximately 6 million PPSH-41s were built during the war. 6 million. At its peak, Soviet factories were producing around 3,000 per day.
The weapon fired the 7.62 by 25mm Tokarev cartridge, a high-velocity round that moved significantly faster than the 9mm Parabellum or .45 ACP used by Western designs. This gave it a flatter trajectory and better penetration at range. The 71-round drum magazine meant that Soviet soldiers could sustain fire long after their opponents needed to reload. The cyclic rate was staggering, approaching 900 rounds per minute in some configurations. In close combat, a Soviet assault wave with PPSH-41s was genuinely terrifying. German veterans of the Eastern Front consistently described the experience of facing massed PPS fire as unlike anything they had prepared for. The weapon had real weaknesses. The drum magazine, for all its capacity, was notoriously finicky. Drums from one weapon sometimes didn't fit another, requiring individual matching. The weapon was somewhat heavy and, at high cyclic rates, consumed ammunition at a rate that stressed supply chains. A simpler version, the PPS-43, was developed and was arguably better in several ways.
1. Owen gun, Australia. And here we arrive at something that rarely gets its due in the popular history of World War II weaponry. Not German engineering precision, not Soviet industrial scale, not American manufacturing genius. The finest submachine gun of the Second World War was designed by a 24-year-old Australian named Evelyn Owen, built in the coastal city of Wollongong, and carried through some of the most brutal jungle fighting of the entire war. What made the Owen gun special? Start with the magazine. The barrel was quick detachable. You could pull the barrel out and replace it in seconds in the field. The separate pistol grip and trigger housing could be removed for cleaning without any tools. The ejection port had a cover. The design was, almost paradoxically given its origins, among the most maintenance-friendly of any weapon of the war. Soldiers in the Pacific who carried it called it a mud plugger. That wasn't an insult. That was a badge of honor. They meant that you could shove this weapon into the mud of a New Guinea riverbank, pull it out, and it would still fire. The Sten would have choked, the Thompson would have needed cleaning, the Owen kept going. Post-war tests carried out by the Australian Army are revealing. Its closest competitor in the test results was its own later replacement, the F1. The MP40 was precise German engineering. The PPSH-41 was the Soviet Union's industrial might made physical. But the Owen gun was something different, a weapon so fundamentally well thought out that it worked when nothing else would, in the conditions that no weapons designer back in a European factory had properly imagined. The soldiers who carried it in Papua New Guinea, Bougainville, and the islands of the Pacific didn't need a ranking list to tell them what they already knew. When the bullets started flying and the rain started falling and the mud swallowed everything, the Owen gun was the weapon you wanted in your hands. That's why it's number 1.
If you liked this video, I'm sure you'll like this one too. Subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Our channel is small, so we are replying every comment below. Comment any other aircraft which you think we missed or any suggestion for future videos. Thanks for watching.